This is the second lesson in Unit 1 of Germany, Paper 3, Weimar and Nazi Germany, 1919 to 1939. And what today's lesson is going to look at is the Weimar Constitution. Now, as a recall, remember, the Weimar was the name of the new republic that was put into place after the First World War. And a constitution is a set of rules. Now, every government needs a set of rules, and especially in this case, a constitution was to make Germany more of a democracy. So for this lesson, we're going to look at the issues that Germany faced because of the First World War again, look at the terms of the Weimar Constitution, and be able to evaluate its strengths and weaknesses, because it's really important we know the Weimar Constitution, because the Weimar Constitution, one of the terms within this set of rules, actually helped parties like Hitler's Nazi Party into power. Okay, and the key words, there are going to be some tough key words for this lesson, and some of the key ones are Article 48 and proportional representation. So, what had been the effect of World War I on Germany? So, you've got a range of pictures here. What could these link to? Pause the video and just make a list of what you think the effect of World War I on Germany could be based on these pictures here. I'll go through them once you unpause the video. So, what have we got? You've got factories closing. Why? Well, because there was less trade. Less trade because the ports had been blocked off. There was less opportunity for European trade in Germany. You also had people on strike. German workers were very unhappy for many, many reasons, mainly because of the fact that the factory owners had been paid so much and the workers had been paid very little, which led to homelessness, which led to people living in poverty, which links to the man holding the cup with the coin being thrown in. And then you've also got the graph of things going down. Now, that could mean many things. It could mean the amount of food that's been produced, because the amount of food that Germany were producing was a lot less. You could also link it to the fact that the amount of money that Germany was getting in, and they were only getting a third of their income in than what they usually got. There's many things you could link that table to. There is no specific answer to that table. And then you've got a blue man or woman figure being stabbed in the back. Now, this is what the people thought the government had done to them by signing the armistice. The armistice was the agreement to say that the war was over on November the 11th, 1918. So Germany faced, I mean, there's some things on here which aren't, some things that Germany did face that aren't on here. So they faced the Spanish flu, killed 750,000 people in Germany. They faced starvation due to the turnip winter of 1916-1917. They faced the Kaiser abdicating to Holland, which led to the new government. So, today's lesson is going to focus on the Weimar Constitution. Now, the first job of the new Weimar government was to create a new set of rules which would help create a democracy. Now, what you need to understand is before the war, Germany will run as a military dictatorship. So this democracy was a new concept which, to be honest, not many people were happy with at the time. I'm going to put an information slide on, and I want you to look at how it was run, the structure of the government, and then you're going to fill in your own your own picture of this to be able to show that you understand how the government of Germany worked. So, I'm going to underline some key things here. I'm going to underline some key things. The Weimar Constitution was a genuine attempt at creating a democracy. It was a way to try and get people freedom. It was a way to try and start a new type of government in Germany. And it was a way of creating a structure for the new government. So, what was the structure? At the very top, you had the president. The president was the head of the state. He was elected every 7 years by the people of Germany. So they actually had specific presidential votes. However, the president played no part in the day-to-day running of Germany. The president had limited roles, but the roles he had were very important. So, for example, he appointed the chancellor in Germany. Now, another term we can use for chancellor is something like the prime minister, okay? The person who runs day-to-day jobs. Another power that the president had that was really important was Article 48. This meant that the president could pass laws without the parliament, the Reichstag, in a time of crisis. So if the president thought something was going wrong, he could turn the country back into a dictatorship overnight. Okay? So even though he hasn't got important day-to-day running of the country, the president is of vital importance. Now, the government, underneath the president, you have the chancellor. The chancellor was the head of the government. Okay? He was chosen by the president. The chancellor was, and this is really important, this next bit, the chancellor was usually the leader of the most popular political party in Germany. And what that means is the party that had the biggest percentage of votes would usually, the leader of that party would usually be asked to become chancellor. The only time this didn't happen was in 1932 when the Nazis gained the biggest share of the votes. The reason for this is because the president didn't trust Hitler. Now, once you're made chancellor, you choose your own government ministers. You choose people to help you run the government. And the chancellor's cabinet was made up of the most important ministers who made all the main decisions which would be voted for. So these people, basically like his team, his group, that help him run the government. So you might have an education minister, a finance minister, very similar to what our prime minister has today. He has loads of different people doing different jobs. So, for example, he has a man called Gavin Williamson who helps him run education. They go to the prime minister with ideas and then they're voted on. Now, the parliament was made up of two groups. Okay, these two groups had to have laws passed through them. So you had the main group, which was the Reichstag. They were the most powerful of the two and they controlled taxes. Now, the Reichstag were voted by the people every 4 years. So basically, the Reichstag are MPs. So in Britain, every election period, we vote for MPs to represent us in the House of Commons. They then discuss and pass votes and say yes or no. Okay? Now, these members of the Reichstag would be voted for at least once every 4 years. But if there was a snap election, then there may be more common or more regular elections and more regular changes in the Reichstag. And then you had the Reichsrat, which elected every 4 years and represented regions of Germany. These were more of a local group rather than a national. They were your localized politics. Now, the people who could vote in Germany were all men and women aged 21 and over. This was one of the freest democracies in Europe. Even Britain didn't have such a free democracy. Okay? Men and women over 21 was a really big age range and gender range, because in some countries women weren't allowed to vote until they were 30. For example, Britain. Now, there is a phrase that I'm going to quickly introduce, and it's about voting. Now, this phrase is something you do need to remember. Proportional representation. What that means is, in the simplest of terms, the percentage of votes a party got equaled the percentage of seats they got in the Reichstag. It's very different to our way, our political system in Britain. What that allowed, it allowed someone to have a say even if they got 1% of a vote. Whereas in our country, if someone got 1% of the vote, they wouldn't be allowed near the House of Commons. Okay? And this, as time went on, this helped parties who were small, who were extreme. If anything, proportional representation was a huge weakness in the democracy, as it allowed loads of different groups. Whereas if you think about our country in Britain, the main groups that you would have within Parliament are probably going to be your Conservatives and your Labour. You might have a few Liberal Democrats, and you've probably got one Green Party MP. If we just take it into perspective, I can't remember the actual election date. It was I think 7 years ago, but there was a party called UKIP. And if proportional representation was used in a general election, I think 7 years ago, UKIP would have gained a much higher percentage of seats. But because they didn't, because we don't run proportional representation, they only got, I think, about a lot less, only about 20 seats, and they should have got a lot more. based on the concept of proportional representation. We will look at this idea a lot more later on in the lesson, but that's the constitution information. And what you need to do now is fill in facts around each one. So this is how it works. President, you need to add facts around that. The president will appoint the chancellor, and the chancellor will appoint their cabinet. The chancellor usually comes from the party that gets the most votes in the Reichstag. Okay? And underneath all of this, you had the electorate, which were all men and women over the age of 21 who voted under proportional representation. The percentage of votes equaled the percentage of seats. 1% of the vote equaled 1% of the seats. Now remember, the Reichstag and the Reichsrat were voted by the people, likewise the president. The difference between the two is the president will be a straight shootout between maybe 2 or 3 people. The Reichstag and the Reichsrat are going to be based on lots of different people representing different parties. The Chancellor gets to choose his own cabinet. Okay, that's the key thing there. And usually the Chancellor would choose a cabinet who has the same ideas to help them pass laws. So, using this information, fill in this picture to be able to develop your understanding of how the structure of Germany works. Spend 5 minutes on that and we'll go from there. Now, for those of you that are a bit unsure about this concept of proportional representation, this is a perfect diagram to show you. What you've got here are the votes. So this bit here, you've got the votes in an election. Now, if there's something called first past the post, which is the system we use in Britain, you would notice here that the party in pink would get most of the seats. Okay? Party in green, even though they didn't get masses of votes, it got very similar to pink, they get less seats than the pink. And then the light blue also gets some seats. There's lots of parties here that don't get any seats because of the first past the post system. So let's just give an example of the first past the post system. Say you've got 4 MPs. One from Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, and the Green Party. And in an election, you could say that Labour get 250,000 votes, Conservatives will get 340,000 votes, Lib Dem, let's say they get 26,000 votes in this constituency, and the Greens get 15,000. Now you've got to remember that each area is a constituency. So each area gets an MP. In this case, under first past the post, the Conservative MP would get the seat. Why? Because they got the most votes. Okay? And once you get past a working majority, then that government can take over. Under proportional representation, every single person that got a vote will have a seat in the Reichstag. So even this tiny little pink line here, they would get some form of seat. It correlates. Everyone that gets a vote will get some form of say in the government, which is what we need to understand. Proportional representation, percentage of votes equals the percentage of seats. So just a little mid-lesson check. Answer these questions. Now, there is one thing I forgot to mention actually, just going back. This group here, the Reichstag, for them to pass a law, there's a golden number that they need. Okay, and this number is going to become very important as time goes on. For them to pass a law, they basically need more than 50%. For them to pass a law in Germany, they need 50% of people to agree with it. That's going to become vital later on. Okay, so just remember that. They need 50%, more than 50% to be able to pass laws in the Reichstag. So how long was the president in power for? What did the Reichstag decide on? Who would use Article 48? What does proportional representation mean? What was the chancellor usually the leader of? Who was the chancellor usually the leader of? What percentage did the Reichstag need to pass a law? And what age and gender could vote in Germany? Give those a go. Won't go through the answers because we've literally just gone through these. Give them the best shot. And if you're not sure of them, then rewind the video and see what you can find. So task 2, we need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the Constitution. This is important because you need to understand that even though there were some good things about this, there were some fundamental weaknesses which caused problems in many years later. So these are the statements. You need to decide if it's a strength or a weakness. Okay, so proportional representation meant that small parties would be in the government. This meant that laws would be harder to pass as there were so many parties with different ideas. That's going to be a weakness. Article 48 could be damaging if the president was weak. Well, that's again a weakness. If the president was power hungry, then he could take advantage of it and destroy the democracy. The chancellor was usually the leader of the most powerful and voted for political party. That's a strength, because at the end of the day, people have voted for this person, voted for this party. So the person in charge is hopefully going to be very popular. The Constitution was constructed that no one person or group could have too much power. That's a strength, because it's making sure that we're not that Germany aren't turning into a dictatorship again, which is really important. Coalition governments frequently fell apart. There were 9 different governments between 1919 and 1923. Now, I best explain that. A coalition is a mixture of political parties. Sometimes they join together to get 50% plus. Why is that important? To pass laws. But the problem was, by joining different parties together, it's a weakness because they didn't get on. There was a great example in Britain when the Conservatives and the Lib Dems joined together to form a majority, and it turned out that most of the time the Conservatives had their way, which caused divisions between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Proportional representation meant that everyone had a fair share to have their say. That's a strength. Everyone had a say. In a time of crisis, the president would use Article 48. This turned Germany into a dictatorship. That's a weakness. Proportional representation meant there were lots of parties in the government. In the 1920s, there were 29 parties. It meant decisions were hard to come by. Can you imagine sitting in a room with 29 people with different ideas? Are you ever going to come to a decision? No. Local government still remained so that regions could control their own services, such as police, courts, and schools. This is going to be a weakness because it means that sometimes the local government would clash with the national government. The government had a lot more power than it did under the Kaiser. It was a lot fairer. That's a strength. Because there were so many political groups, coalition governments had to be created. This was bad because laws would not be passed easily. Weakness. All women and men were allowed to vote, and voting age was reduced from 25 to 21. That makes it a strong democracy. The Reichsrat could delay new laws passed by the Reichstag unless the Reichstag overruled it. I mean, this is a weakness because it shows that the Reichstag and the Reichsrat might sometimes come into conflict with one another. In times of crisis, a government seemed weak. That's obviously weak. And the Reichstag needed 50% to pass laws, a high number for the government, which was made up of so many different groups. That's another weakness of this constitution. So, you answer these questions now. Again, it's checking your knowledge through recall and retention. Pause the video and answer this. And then I'd like to finish with this. Explain why some people might suggest the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start. What I want you to do is write a paragraph explaining why some people might think that the Weimar Republic was weak from the start and it was never, ever going to work. And once you've written that, you've then covered the second lesson on the Weimar Constitution. Now, this is something you must understand, so watching over it again wouldn't do you any harm to make sure that you get the rest of the course.